Hi, like and subscribe for the more true horror stories. Story 1.
Her parents watched her as she sat in the corner and played with her friend. They found it cute how she made an imaginary friend. They continued to watch her playing as she picked up her teapot. "Would you like some more tea, friend?" Here she asked the air. Here she let out a giggle before pouring tea into the cup. Her mother smiled at her before walking towards her, bending down to be at eye level with her youngest daughter, Mimi. "Honey, who's your friend?" he asked her. Her daughter stopped looking at the empty spot in front of her before bringing her attention to her mother. She smiled big at her mother, pointing at the air. "This is friend," she tells her happily. Her mother looked at the spot her daughter was pointing at. She looked back at her child. "I know it's your friend. I asked what their name was," she tells her daughter. Mimi thought about for a minute. "Oh well, mommy, his name is Friend," she tells her. Her mother raised an eyebrow at that answer. She knew kids called their imaginary friends all kind of names, but this seemed different, just Friend. She asked the small child. Her daughter nodded. "He told me his real name, but he said I should just call him Friend." Her mother glanced back at Spot again before asking, "And what is his real name?" she asked hesitantly. She watched as her daughter shook her head. "Nope, can't tell you," was all Mimi said. "Why?" she asked her. Mimi looked back at the Spot before nodded. Okay. Yeah, I understand," she says to the air before looking at her mother. "He said that you don't need to know. And if you ask again, something's gonna happen." Her mother's eyes go wide with shock as she stands up fast, still looking at the empty spot. She starts leaving, but as she goes, she hears her daughter speaking again. "That wasn't very nice, Friend." Something wasn't right. She decided she was going to find out more about her daughter's friend. That night, she tucked her daughter in her bed. She figured she'd try and get more information. "So Mimi, why don't you tell me more about your friend?" Mimi let out a loud yawn. "Like what, mommy?" she asked sleepy her mother, though, about what to ask. Mimi was only 6 after all. "Well, how about where did Friend come from?" Mimi started to slowly close her eyes. "That's easy, mommy. He used to live here a long time ago," she tells her. That didn't make sense. This house was just built about a year before they moved in this house. She asked her sleepy daughter. Mimi shook her head slowly, sleep starting to take her. "Not this house, but something else. I can't remember what he said, but he said he had fun with all his friends here. But then something bad happened, and they were all gone," she tells her as she falls asleep. Her mother sits on the edge of the bed, thinking over everything she said. As she began to stand, something flew past her head, hitting the wall behind her. She looks down to see one of Mimi's dolls without its head. She turned around slowly, worried what was behind her, but when she looked, nothing was there. Whoever or whatever Friend was, he sure didn't want her to know anything about him, and that thought alone scared her more than she thought it would. She left her daughter's room and went to her own room. She crawled into bed next to her husband. She could hear him quietly snoring. She closed her eyes and drifted off to sleep. In the middle of the night, she felt something on top of her and began to wake up. When she opened her eyes, she seen a man staring back at her. She tried to scream, but he covered her mouth. The moonlight light up the room and she could see the man better. Her eyes went wide in fear. This, whatever it was not a man. Its eyes were black. Its hair was also black, and it was long. She could see it went down its back. Its face wore a twisted expression. Its nails were long and sharp. She could feel them cutting into her cheek as it covered her mouth. It smiled sinisterly at her before bringing a finger to its lips, telling her to be quiet. She nodded at it, hoping that it would let go of her. She was relieved when it did, in fact, let go. "Now stop asking questions," it hissed at her. She let out a gasp. "This was Friend," she whispers. Friend tilted his head to the side before smiling big, showing her sharp-looking teeth. He pointed a long nail at her. "No more," he hissed angrily before disappearing. She let out a loud gasp before sitting up in her bed, breathing heavily. She looked around frantically, looking for Friend. "It was just a dream," she says to herself quietly. She lays back down as she runs her hands down her face. She freezes when she feels the cut on her cheek. She lays there thinking, if that wasn't a dream, and that thing was Friend, if he can do that, what else was he capable of doing?
She couldn't go back to sleep after her encounter with Friend. Every time she closed her eyes, his twisted expression would appear. The next morning when her husband woke up, he noticed something was off with her. "You okay, honey?" He asked her. She could hear the worry in his voice. She gave him a small smile. Yes, I'm fine. Just didn't sleep very well. She replies she didn't know if it would be a good idea to mention friend to him or not, but she figured it would be best till she found out more herself before telling him. It was Monday morning, so she had to drop her oldest 2 children to school. Then it was of the store for some shopping. Once they were at the store, she decided to try and ask Mimi some more about friend. She just hopes he wouldn't do anything in the store. He doesn't want people to know about him, so he shouldn't. But there's no tell what he'd do when they were alone. As she pushed Mimi in the cart, she walked down a crowded aisle. She just hopes this works. She looks down at her daughter before putting on a smile. So, Mimi, does friend go everywhere with you? She asked. First, she figured if it was an innocent question, he wouldn't get suspicious. Mimi looked up from her doll and shook her head. No, mommy, friend can't leave the house. Well, he can go in the yard, but that's it. She let out a sigh of relief. So friend wasn't with them now, she thought. So Mimi, how did you meet friend? She asked carefully. Mimi was still very young, and she has no idea that her imaginary friend is something else entirely. She watched as Mimi thought about it for a moment before she shrugged her shoulders at the question. And I don't know. One night he was just there at the end of my bed, and he told me he was my friend now. The mother thought for a moment before decided she'd push for just a little more information. What does friend look like, Mimi? She asked. The image from last night popping into her head, that truly is what friend looks like. She doesn't know how Mimi could handle it. Now held up her doll, running her fingers through its long black hair. His long black hair like Polly does. His eyes are all black and his nails are long and very sharp. He told me not to touch them or I could get cut. Mimi tells her still messing with her doll's hair. She couldn't believe Mimi could handle seeing something like that. That sounds kind of scary to me. She tells her she tried to keep her voice calm. Mimi nodded her head at her mother. I was scared at first, but he told me he looks like that to keep the bad thing away. Her mother looked down at her. Bad thing, there's something worse than friend. She thought they grabbed what all they needed and headed out to pay. Once they had all their groceries in the car, Mimi was all buckled up. They headed home. When they got halfway there, she glanced in the mirror. Mimi, before speaking to her, Mimi, honey, let's not tell friend about our little talk, okay? Mimi gave her a confused look, but why, mommy, she asked. Why was a good question. She just couldn't tell her daughter that friend was something bad and that she was scared of him, so the mother came up with a better idea. When they pulled up to a red light, she turned and looked at Mimi. She put on a fake smile because I want him to be my friend too, but I don't want him to know yet. Okay, honey. She tells her, of course, Mimi couldn't tell her mother was lying to her. Mimi let out a laugh and shook her head. That won't work, mommy. She tells her, still laughing. She raised an eyebrow at this. It won't work, honey, she asked, hesitant. Mimi smiled big at her. It almost reminded her friend's smile. Friend doesn't like grown-ups, mommy. He said they always interfere, whatever that means, she tells her, still smiling. Her mother felt her blood run cold. She was pulled from her thoughts when the car behind her honked his horn, telling her to go. She shook her head and started to move again. Once they made it home, she looked up at the house. One thought went through her mind as she watched Mimi run inside, calling for friend as she did so. And if she got in friend's way, what would he really do to her? Once she got all the groceries in the house, she headed towards the kitchen to put them away. She opened the fridge and began putting the food away. Once she was done, she closed the fridge door and jumped back. Right behind the door was friend, smiling down at her. He was much more terrifying than he seemed the other night. He stood over 6 foot. His long black hair covered half his face, making his already creepy, sharp smile more terrifying. His black eyes held something in them that she couldn't place. He was holding his hand up, wiggling his long claw like nails at her. It reminded her of what a child would do if they were trying to be cute and say hello. She wonders why he's showing himself to her. Did Mimi tell him what they talked about? Is he here to scare her to stop asking questions? So many thoughts were going through her mind when all of a sudden Mimi came running in and grabbed friend's leg, wrapping her little arms around it. Giggle, here, your friend. Come on, let's go play. She says to an excited friend, looked down at her before nodded and started to leave. When he got to the entrance of the kitchen, he stopped. Does mommy want to play too? He asked, tilting his head to the side to look at her. Were you... Her mother shook slightly with fear before she slowly shook her head. Friend tilted his head to the other side. Are you sure? He asked slowly, his twisted smile never leaving his face. When she didn't answer or move, friend straightened his head before waving the same way at her again. Bye-bye, mommy. He tells her, making her blood run cold. She watched as both friend and Mimi headed into the living room. The way friend said bye made chills run down her spine. The way he said it seemed more sinister than it should have been. Was that a simple buy, or did that mean he was going to do something to her or Mimi? She thought. She made her way to the entrance of the kitchen and stuck her head slowly out. There in the living room was Mimi pour fake tea into a cup, just like the first day she found out about Friend. But this time she was able to see Friend, and it made the cute image of her daughter playing into something much more creepy, as if he knew she was watching Friend, looked up and gave her another twisted smile. Her eyes went wide as she pulled herself back into the kitchen. Friend needed to go, and he needed to go now, she thought frantically. She ran her hand through her, trying to think of what to do. Her eyes went wide with realization when something popped into her head. WW, there's only one person that can help. She looked down. Sadly, I just really hope they'll hear me out, she says quietly. The next day, she left Mimi with the neighbor across the street. She told them she had something she needed to do, and she couldn't bring Mimi with her. I'll probably be back in a few hours. If I'm not, my husband will pick Mimi up after work, if that's okay, Mrs. Mario. She says to the old woman. Mrs. Mario just nodded slowly. That's fine, dearie. I'll see either one of you later, Mr. Mario tells her with a smile as she ushers Mimi inside. Bye, Mommy, Mimi says with a small wave. She looked down at her, bending down. She gave her a big hug. Bye, Mimi, she says as she kisses the top of her head. I'll be back, I promise, she whispered the last part as she turned towards her car and began driving to her donation. It took about an hour before she pulled up to a looking house. She sat in the car for a moment, contemplating her decision. With a long sigh, she got out of the car. She stood in front of the house, taking it all in. The once white fence was now old and weathered, its white paint almost all gone. Each fence posted had a strange symbol craved into it. She opened the gate and headed up to the door. Before she reached the door, a voice spoke out, well, look what the cat dragged in. She watched as the woman opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. Her arms crossed and an unamused look on her face. Now, what brings you here, Teresa? The woman asked, her voice lanced with slight anger. Before Teresa could answer, the woman cut her off, if I remember correctly. It was who said, what was it again? She asked, tapping her chin, pretending to think. Oh, that's right, she said with a snap of her fingers. It would stay the hell away from my family demon. She snapped, her voice full of venom. Isn't that right, sister? She demanded. Teresa looked down regrettably. Nico, please, Teresa says, sadly still looking at the ground. She couldn't bring herself to look her sister in the eyes. Nico clicked her tongue in irritation. You think you can come here, and asked for something after what you did. Nico asked as she steps off the porch and stands in front of Teresa. What did you expect me to do? Teresa asked as she slowly raised her head to look at Nico. Nico uncrossed her arms and started circling her, glaring as she did. So, Teresa, I put up with a lot of your shit over the years. And he tells her Teresa didn't move, but she did watch Nico's every move with her eyes. She raised one of her hands, began to count as she raised a finger, one when we entered middle school. And I was bullied. You didn't help me, she says sadly as she raised another finger. Two, acted like you didn't even know me. You ignored me throughout middle school. Then when we got home, acted like nothing happened. She snapped, her anger growing with each word. She said, Teresa closed her eyes, unable to look at the look in Nico's eyes. Nico raised another finger, still glaring at her. 3 in high school, the bullying got worse, and you joined in with them, she says. Teresa could hear to sadness in Nico's voice when she said it. Teresa fought back the tears that began to form in her eyes. She remembered everything Nico went through and everything she did to her. Nico stopped circling Teresa, coming to face her. Nico lowered her hand and gave her a sad smile. She knew Teresa couldn't see it with her eyes closed, but even after all that, I still forgave you. I still loved you. But then you called me a demon, and that was the last straw. I was done forgiving. She tells her, the venom back in her voice. Teresa let out a shaky breath before opening her eyes to stare right into Nico's. What did you expect, Nico? You were teaching Sarah. How did you think I would react? She snapped, waving her hands in front of her. Nico rolled her eyes. She had the gift. I was teaching her how to control it. Nico snapped back, what wrong, sister, afraid people would call her a freak or demon. Nico hissed the last part. Teresa glared at her. I didn't want her to learn how to control it. I wanted it to go away. She shouts at Nico. This was a mistake. Teresa knew Nico wouldn't listen to her, let alone help her. And she honestly couldn't blame her. Nico went through hell growing up because of what she could do. Nico gave her a smirk. Yeah, and when you don't teach them how to control it, you end up with the situation you're in right now. Nico says, crossing her arms again. Nico watched as Teresa's eyes went wide in shock. Teresa grabbed the front of Nico's shirt. What did you do? She demanded. Nico looked down at her hand and gave a small laugh before she easily removed her hand. I didn't do anything, Teresa. This is all Mimi's doing. I told you if they don't learn, then there's trouble. Nico tells her. She straightens her shirt and sits down on the porch. She pats the spot beside her. So many different thoughts were going through Teresa's mind before her shoulders slumped and she sat beside Nico. There was only silence between them as the looked up at the sky. Teresa broke it first when she decided to ask. You already knew the reason I was here, didn't you? She watched as Nico nodded her head. I knew it would be only a matter of time. Nico replies. Nico glanced at Teresa from the corner of her eye before speaking again. It was either going to be when something happened to Mimi or he made himself known to you. Teresa looked back at Nico, shocked with how much her sister already knew him. She asked, wondering if Nico truly knew or not. Nico let out a small chuckle as she stood back up and stretched her back. You know who I mean, Teresa. I'm talking about Fred. She tells her. Nico looks down at her, or his, friend. Teresa head snapped up at Nico, her eyes wide with worry and slight fear. How did Nico know all of this already? Chow, she asked, her voice shaking as she did. Nico let out another chuckle as she stuck her hand out to help her up. Remember, sister dear, you told me to stay away, but I have friends on the other side. Nico tells her with a wink as she helped Teresa to her feet. Deco headed to the door before turning her head slightly to look at Teresa. Well, come on, we can discuss everything inside, was all she said as she walked and leaving Teresa alone to make her choice. Teresa stood there for a few minutes thinking everything over. She could either go back home and deal with Friend, or should she said Fred by herself, or she could hear what Nico knows and hope she'd help her. Teresa let out a defeated sigh before grabbing the doorknob, going in. Only one thing's matter now, and that is getting rid of Friend and saving Mimi. Once they entered the house, Teresa took a long look around as memories of their childhood flashed into her mind. She remembered how her and Nico would sit at the top of the stairs and watch their mother walk around talking to the spirits that came to her. Teresa ran her hand over the stair railing, stopping when she felt the small, craving, sad smile form on her face as she looks at it. It was a strange-looking symbol. If anyone was to notice it, they wouldn't think anything of it, but she knew all too well what it meant and why it was there. Nico watched her as she leaned on the wall, arms crossed over her chest. Nico wore the same sad smile. Do you remember the day Mom craved that into the railing? Nico asked Teresa. Teresa hesitated for a moment. Not really. I remember running downstairs and feeling it as my hand pasted it. Teresa pulled her hand back and turned towards Nico. Do you remember? She asked. Nico unfolded her arms and pushed off the wall. Teresa watches. Nico started to walk to the dining room without being told anything. Teresa followed her. Nico walked to the table that sat in the middle of the room and pulled out one of the chairs. Nico gestured with her hand for Teresa to take a seat, still not saying a word. You could just say, take a seat, Teresa says with a sigh as she pulls the other chair out and sits down. Erica placed her arms on the table, resting her chin on her hands. She gave Teresa a serious look. This wasn't something Teresa was used to seeing on her sister's face. Nico's was always so carefree and never serious before she could ask Nico about it. Nico asked something first. Have you seen Friend yet? Teresa gave her a strange look at least twice. Why? She asked. What did he look like? Nico asked, not answering Teresa's question. She still had that serious look on her face. Teresa sat back in the chair and closed her eyes, trying to recall how he looked. Tall, skinny, long black hair, long sharp claw-like nails, and solid black eyes and sharp teeth. She replied as she opens her eyes to look back at Nico. Nico gave her a sad look before lifting her head off her hands. Nico rubbed the back of her neck as she let out a frustrated sigh. Well, guess we should start from the beginning, Nico says. Teresa sat up straight at hearing this. Finally, Nico was going to tell her everything she knew about Friend and maybe even help her get rid of him. Or at least she hoped Nico would help, if not for her, then at least for Mimi's sake. Well, first thing is his name is Frederick Day. He was murdered in the late 50s, early 60s. Nico began. Teresa's eyes went wide in shock and fear her sweet baby. Mimi was playing with a killer. He was caught and hanged for his crimes. Nico continued before Teresa cut her off. Who did he kill and how many? She asked, her shaking as she did. Nico gave her a look. Teresa, does that really matter? She began but was cut off again. Yes, it does. Teresa tells her strongly, Nico gave her another look, fine. But remember, you asked, I was just going to skip it. Nico tells her, Teresa only nodded. Fred was very smart and twisted man. All his victims were families. He would befriend the children of the family that had the misfortune of being his. And Teresa sat there in shock. So many thoughts running through her mind. She shook her head to try and clear it before she brought her attention back to Nico. Nico watched Teresa's reaction and waited a moment before she continued. He told the children he was their friend and that they should call him friend. He told them not to tell their parents because he wanted it to be a surprise when they met him. Teresa gave Nico an odd look as if Nico could read her mind. She answered her unasked question. He used the children to bring their parents to him. Once they did, he would torture the parents for days to a week before killing them. As he did all this, he would make the children watch, telling them that they were the cause of their parents' death. Once he seen that the child was broken completely, he then killed them as well. Teresa let out a shocked gasp as she covered her mouth with her hand. That was just horrible. Making a child watch something like that would obviously break their psyche. Then he took their life as well. Nico gave Teresa, so I looked the number of deaths that were found out about was 100 to 200. No one is sure if there is more or not. They could only get a rough number from him before he was hanged. Nico finished, hoping this was enough for Teresa. Nico knew more details about the murders, but she didn't think Teresa could handle all of it. How did he get caught? She heard Teresa ask in a small, shaky voice. Nico rubbed the back of her neck again. He thought he was unstoppable, but his last target was his downfall. He befriended the child, but unlike the others, this child told his parents about Friend and everything he said and where his playhouse was. Nico told her with a small, triumphant smile, and of course they called the police. There was no trial or investigation. Once the police found him in his playhouse, that was all they needed. They kept him alive for a week, trying to get all they could out of him. Once they figured out he wasn't going to tell them anymore, they killed him, and that was the end of him. Nico finished telling her. Teresa still had so many questions, so she figured she'd just ask, where was he killed? Nico stares at her for a moment. He was hanged on the nice big tree in your backyard, Nico answered hesitantly. Teresa stands up fast, eyes wide, in shock. Is that why? Is around Mimi? Because she plays around that tree? She ran her hand over her hair. She starts to freak out. Nico shakes her head no. Just being around the tree wouldn't be enough to do it. Nico tells her, but the way she said it told Teresa Nico either had an idea how it happened or she already knew how. Teresa crossed her arms over her chest and gave Nico a stern look. You know how this happened, don't you, Nico? She asked strongly. Yes and no, Nico replies. Teresa's stern look turned into a glare, meaning, is all she said. Nico let out a long, frustrated sigh before she glared back at Teresa, meaning Mimi probably found something that he's connected to. Nico says, before she stands turning her back to Teresa and walking towards a bookshelf, pulling a book out, plus your past with Friend, probably didn't help. Teresa heard Nico say before she turned facing Teresa again and walked back to the table, placing the book. Teresa gave her a strange look. What do you mean by past with him? Teresa demanded. Nico raised an eyebrow at her. Why do you think Mom craved that symbol on the stairs, Teresa? Nico asked. And all Teresa did was shrug her shoulders. Nico finally realized what happened all those years ago and why Teresa's personality had changed so drastically. When they were kids, their mother did something to her. Nico just hoped this wouldn't break Teresa's psyche. Teresa used to be able to see Friend, Nico says slowly. Teresa stood there frozen in shock, only one thing going through her mind. Why couldn't she remember any of this? Teresa and Nico sat in silence for what felt like hours, but was only a few minutes. So many thoughts were going through Teresa's head. Teresa ran a shaky hand, though, her hair trying to clam her thoughts. Nico watched Teresa, her eyes held sadness in them for her sister. She never thought there could have been reason Teresa changed so much in school. Nico knew that if they wanted to save Mimi and put an end to Friend once, and for all, they were going to have to get to the bottom of whatever their mother did to Teresa to make her forget. Nico ran her hands on her face and let out a frustrated sigh. Of course, all of this would have something to do with their mother. Nico figured the best place to start is with how much Teresa remembered. Teresa, what do you remember from our childhood? She asked. Teresa gave her a strange look before thinking about it. What did she remember? Nico watched her carefully. If their mother did do something to Teresa, if they pushed too far and fast, it could cause Teresa a lot of mental pain, and that's the last thing Nico wants for her. I remember watching Mom walking around talking to the spirits. Teresa said, making air quotes when she said spirits, because she always thought it was something Nico and their mother made up. Teresa continued, also remember school, all the horrible things I said and did to you. Teresa looked at Nico, her eyes full of regret for all the pain she caused to her. Teresa doesn't know how or way Nico is helping her after everything she's done. But again, Nico always was there for Teresa no matter what. Or even after Teresa kicked her out of her house and made it so Nico could never see what family she had left again. But it looks like Nico's been watching them all this time since she already knows everything that is going on with Mimi. Thinking about Mimi made Teresa think back to something Nico said when she first arrived. I have friends on the other side. Never mind. Nico, what did you mean when you said friends on the other side? Teresa asked, Nico gave her a small smile. You told me to stay away from your family, but you need to remember you and your kids are my family too, which means I was going to make sure you all were safe. So I had someone from the other side watch over y'all, and they did until friend came along. He was stronger than the one I had watching over you. Nico tells her like it was no big deal. Teresa couldn't believe it even after everything. Nico still made sure they were safe. Nico reached her hand out and pulled the forgotten book towards her, slowly opening it before turning a few pages. When she found the page she wanted, she turned it around and pushed it to Teresa. Teresa glanced down at the book to see it was a photo album. The photo staring up at her was of Nico, and her self-candles were lit around them, and they were playing with something. Upon closer inspection, she could see it was a Ouija board. Teresa was shocked. When did they play with Ouija board? Teresa started flipping thought the album, looking at all the photos. They were all of Nico and her doing something that had to do with spirits, magic, or charms. Teresa stared at the album, trying to remember when any of this happened. She had no memory of any of it. Teresa sat up straight and gave Nico a confused look. Nico, in return, gave her a sympathetic look. I wondered if she did something to you. Now I know I'm right, Nico tells her sadly. What do you mean? Nico, when did all this happen? Why can't I remember any of it? And who did something to me? Teresa asked, scared. She began to shake. She felt like part of her past was taken from her, and she doesn't even know when it happened. Nico watched Teresa shake before slowly standing up and walking behind her, and did something she hasn't done in years. Teresa stopped shaking when she felt Nico's arm wrap around her. In a tight hug, Teresa felt something she hasn't felt in years. She felt safe in her sister's embrace. Teresa felt something wet land on her face. I'm sorry, Teresa. I'm so sorry. I never noticed, she heard Nico say quietly as she continued to slowly cry. Teresa brought her hand up and grabbed Nico's arm, holding it there as tears slowly fell down her own face. Teresa thought back as far as she could, but the earliest memory she can remember is the day that symbol was carved into the stairs banister. Anything before that is just a blur. Teresa tightened her grip of Nico's arm before releasing a shaky breath. Nico, what happened the day before Mom carved that symbol on the stairs? Teresa could feel Nico stiffing up when she asked that. All right, Teresa, I'll tell you. Nico said as she lets go of Teresa and walks back to her chair, sitting back down. Nico and Teresa shared a look before Nico started lighting candles that were on the table. But if we're going to have this discussion, then we need someone else too. Nico tells her as she finishes lighting the candles. Teresa gave her a confused look, who she asked, wondering who else would know about her past. Nico gave her a serious look before answering Mom. Teresa gave Nico an odd look. I'm sorry, Nico, I must have misheard you. Did you just say Mom? Teresa asked jokingly, thinking Nico was kidding. Nico gave a small nod as her answer as she closed her eyes to try and concentrate. Teresa fell back in her chair, letting out a little laugh. You mean the mom that's been dead for a decade? And do tell sister how we're going to do that. As she asked Nico, skeptical. Nico let out a loud sigh as she opened one eye to glare at Teresa. If you would stop talking and be quiet, I will summon her here, Nico replied as she closed her eye again. Or should I say, I'll try. I don't know if she will or not. Nico said, added the last part fast. Teresa caught it though and sat up straight in her chair, glaring back at Nico. And what do you mean by that? Teresa asked, crossing her arms over her chest. I thought you could talk and summon the dead with no problem. You didn't seem to have an issue sending something to my house. So why now? Teresa snapped, getting angry with how much time she is wasting on all of this. Nico's eyes shot open as she slammed her hands on the table, standing up fast, glaring back at Teresa. Don't you dare get that tone with me. Teresa, this isn't my fault. If you want to blame anyone, blame our mother. And IQ shouted back at her, and I can talk to anyone and anything, but if they don't want to come, I can't do anything to stop. Teresa has never seen the look that was in Nico's eyes at that moment. She slowly sat back, trying to make herself seem smaller. Nico noticed this and slumped her shoulders and slowly sat back, done, releasing a frustrated sigh. Teresa, like, I understand you're angry and scared, but you can't take it out on me. Teresa gave a small nod as she tried to clam herself down. I'm not thrilled. Having to summon Mom, trust me, she's the last person I want to talk to, dead or alive, but I don't know what she did to you, and if I try to hard or do something wrong in regaining your memories, it can break your psyche, and that's the last thing I want to do to you. Nico says, hanging her head low, Teresa could hear the worry in Nico's voice as spoke. Teresa thought about what all Nico just said. She wondered, what would happen if they didn't get their mom there? What will happen if we break my psyche? Nico's head shoot up, the worry ever present in her eyes. You'll go mad, Teresa. She replies, it's not worth it. If we can't get Mom here, we won't push you. I can deal with friend without your memories. Teresa could see the fear in Nico's eyes, even after everything. Nico still cares so much for her. And that hurt Teresa more than the lost memories. Teresa looked down at her hands folded in her lap, trying to figure everything out. But something was bugging her. Why was Nico so angry at their mother and so worried that she wouldn't come? Last time she's seen both of them, they got along just fine. So what would change to make Nico so angry and against talking to someone that she looked up to for so long? Teresa brought her attention back to Nico to see she had her eyes closed and was concentrated again. Teresa swallowed hard. It was now or never to ask before something worse happened. She cleared her throat. Nico, was all she got as an answer. What happened with you and Mom? When I left, you both got along just fine. What changed? Teresa asked hesitantly. Teresa watched as Nico stiffed up again before opening her eyes again to give her a look. That red, are you serious right now? Teresa nodded fast, ready to find out everything. Nico ran a hand though her hair and let out another sign, something she's been doing a lot. Teresa noted, look, says, I don't want to destroy the image you have of Mom, but when she got sick, she changed. She wasn't the woman we grew up with. She did things I had to deal with and fix after her death. Things that have probably shortened my life, Nico tells her sadly. Teresa's eyes went wide with shock. What do you mean, Nico? Teresa asked, worried. I mean, she started cursing, people summoning things that shouldn't have been brought back to our world, making deals she couldn't keep. It took me months after her death to clean it all up, and I'm not sure I even got everything. And honestly, wouldn't surprise me if she's not the reason friend popped back up. Teresa couldn't believe what she was hearing. Was their mother really capable of doing something like that? Why would she do that? Nico shrugged her shoulders. I honestly don't know. But after everything I made sure she couldn't come back here by herself after her death. I did the same for your house too, Nico says as she sits upright in her chair. Nico laid her hands on the table looking at Teresa. Are you ready, Teresa? She asked. Teresa knew what she had to do. She pulled her own hands up and put them in Nico's hands, slowly nodding, ready for answer and hoping that their mother would come. Nico gave her a small smile before her hands closed on Teresa's. They both closed their eyes and Nico let out a slow breath before speaking clearly. I call upon the spirit of Isabel Ray. Teresa and Nico waited a few minutes before trying again. I command the spirit of Isabel Ray to show herself now, Nico said, and a little irritated. After a few more minutes, Teresa heard Nico let out a growl. Come on, Mom, stop being a baby and get your ass in here, Nico shouted. Teresa started to let go of Nico's hands when they both felt a cold chill enter the room and heard a familiar voice. How dare you get that tone with me, Nico? Teresa said, irritated. Teresa and Nico opened their eyes and turned to the chair between them, seeing their mother sitting there looking very angry. Nico had a sarcastic smile on her face as she spoke. Nice to see you again, Mother. Their mother glared at Nico, not pleased at all for being summoned or how Nico spoke to her. Teresa looked at her sadly. She looked so different from the last time Teresa had seen her. Their mother's eyes that once was bright and filled with joy and love were now dim and full of anger and hated, and that hated was pointed at Nico at the moment. Nico glared back at their mother just with the same hated in her eyes. Teresa forgot how much Nico took after their mother. Same jet black hair and bright blue eyes. Teresa herself took after their father. She had the same chestnut brown hair and light green eyes as him. So, are you going to tell me why you so rudely called me here, Nico? Their mother hissed with venom in her voice. What did you do, Teresa? Nico demanded. Teresa could feel the tension in the air. Maybe this wasn't a good idea, she thought. My mother looked around, ignoring Nico's question. It wasn't very nice of you to put seals up in my own home, Nico. She says, still looking around, trying to figure out where Nico hid them all. Nico smirked at her. I know that was the point once you were dead. The last thing I wanted was you back in here, making my life hell again. Nico says, crossing her arms over her chest. Now answer the question. What did you do to Teresa? Teresa watched both of them, wondering if they even remember she was here. Teresa flinched when their mother looked at her, a strange look on her face. Before she glanced at Nico from the corner of her eye, before a sinister smile made its way on her lips. Teresa, sweetie, did Nico ever tell you how I died? He asked sweetly. Teresa saw Nico's eyes go dark for a second before she hissed at their mother, don't go there. You brought it on yourself. Teresa was confused, but before she could ask what that meant, their mother spoke. Go ahead. Nico, tell your sister how I'm dead. Because of you. Teresa's eyes widened from shock before she slowly turned to Nico, a look of fear in her eyes. Nico's eyes were hard and cold as she glared at their mother, not even sparing a glance to Teresa. She knew what their mother was trying to do, and she was done with it already. I'm not playing your games, mother. You answer the question now, or I'll make you... Nico says, seriously. Their mother just smiled and laughed at Nico. Oh, yeah, and what are you going to do if I don't, Nico? She challenged. Nico clicked her tongue as she stood and walked to a cabinet, slowly opening it and retrieve a box from it. As Nico reached the table, she sat the box down, allowing Teresa and their mother to get a good look at the top of it. It had another strange symbol on it that Teresa couldn't figure out. She glanced at their mother to see a slight look of fear on her face. Whatever that symbol was, their mother obviously knew what it was and didn't like it. Nico smiled when she noticed the look on their mother's face. She opened the box and pulled out a small sliver chain with a violet glass stone at the end. Teresa remembered that necklace their mother always wore it. She never took it off. Her mother's eyes went wide when she saw it. Nico laid the necklace on the table, never taking her eyes off of their mother. Nico put a hand over the glass stone. Now, this is the last time I'm going to ask, what did you do, Teresa? She spoke clear and calm to make sure their mother understood what the consequences was if she continued her game. Their mother's eyes moved from Nico to her hand. You wouldn't dare, brat. She hissed. Nico rolled her eyes as she slowly pressed her palm down on the stone. Teresa watched as the stone slowly began to crack. Your mother grabbed her chest. Okay, Nico, stop. I'll tell you, she said, fast and panicked. Nico stared at her for a moment before removing the pressure from the stone, her hand still hovering above it. Better start talking than Nico tells her. Nico, what just happened and what does mom's necklace have to do with it? Teresa asked worried Nico, and their mother turned to her just remembered she was there. Nico cut her eyes at their mother before letting out a loud sigh. When someone dies, they can attach themselves to an item that meant something to them, and they can come back whenever they'd like. Which is exactly what our mother did with... Nico explains as she holds the necklace up. That's why I put it in that box with a sealing symbol on the top of it. And there's another symbol in the cabinet that this sits on. Nico points back at the cabinet behind her, and if I was to destroy it, she would never be able to come back without me summoning her. Isn't that right, mother? Nico asked smugly. Yes, you're right. Their mother replied quietly. Teresa thought about everything for a moment. She glanced between Nico and their mother, wondering if Nico would destroy something that meant so much to their mother. But with the look in Nico's eyes, she was starting to believe that she would do it just to watch their mother suffer. Teresa decided that she wanted something else answered before they get into her past. Teresa cleared her throat, gaining Nico and their mother's attention. They both stopped their glaring match and gave Teresa a questioning look. Teresa looked down fast before taking a deep breath. What do you mean Nico's the reason you died? Teresa asked hesitantly. You mean Nico never told you? Their mother asked sweetly. She cut her eyes at Nico before looking back at Teresa fast with an upset look on her face. Teresa, it was horrible. Nico could have saved me, but no. She turned and left me there dying on the floor, she says as she pretended to cry. Teresa turned to Nico, a confused look on her face. Many thoughts were going through her head. Nico would never leave their mother for dead, would she? Nico didn't spare Teresa a glance as she continued to glare at their mother, who in return just smiled sweetly back at her. Nico knew what she was doing. She was trying to play them. She was hoping she could get Teresa to turn on Nico and start a fight and forget the reason they brought their mother then in the first place. Nico cracked her knuckles before raising her right hand over the glass stone, letting it hover over it for a moment. Nico made sure their mother was watching before she slammed her hand down. Fast, stop. Their mother shouted. Nico stopped right before her hand hit the stone. She could hear the fear in their mother's voice. Nico glanced up at her, seeing the same fear from her voice. In her dead eyes, Nico looked at Teresa. From the corner of her eyes, she could see Teresa's hands covering her mouth, probably from the shock of everything. Her face let out a loud sigh. She was done with this game. The more time they wasted, the harder it will be to get rid of friend, and she knew that she needed to end this and end it fast. Enough, mother. You made that mess yourself, but you are right. I did leave you there to... Nico says, crossing her arms over her chest. Teresa stared at Nico in shock. You left her. She asked Nico, her voice shaking a bit. Nico rubbed her eyes and frustrated before looking Teresa in the eyes. Teresa, listen. When mom got brain cancer, she lost it. She made a deal with a demon that if she freed 13 of his demon's followers, he would cure her. Nico says, pointing at their mother. Teresa tilted her head to the side at their mother, memory popping up in her mind of her always telling Nico and Teresa what they must never do. But you told us to never make deals. She asked in disbelief. Nico snickered, gaining Tressa's attention. Go ahead, mother. Tell Teresa what all you did. Nico says their mother sat straight back against her chair, keeping her mouth shut tight. Nico leaned over the table a bit, smirking at her. Oh, you don't want to talk about it now? As she asked, still smirking at her, Nico sat back up. That's fine, I'll tell her. And when I'm done, you're going to tell us what you do to Teresa, Nico tells her sternly. Nico turned towards Teresa, reaching her hand out, laying it on her arm, gaining Teresa's full attention. Nico let out a sigh. I remember it real, she says, thinking back to that day 10 years ago. Nico walked up the steps on the pouch grocery and hands a smile on her face. As she reached out, grabbing the doorknob, turning it before stepping in the door and kicking it shut. Nico turned around, letting out a loud gasp, dropping all the grocery on the floor. In front of her was her mother laying on the floor, looking up at someone Nico thought she'd never see in their house. Nico's eyes were wide as she took in its appearance. To anyone else, it would look like a very handsome man, but Nico could see what he really was. It looked almost like a shadow, but it had glowing crimson eyes, sharp teeth, and long claws. Nico hesitantly walked towards her mother, her eyes never leaving the shadow-like creature. And Mom, what's going on? She asked, as she bent down to help her mother to her feet. The creature tilted its head to the side, an amused smile on its face by the look in your eyes. I'm going to say you have the gift like your mother, am I right? Asked. Nico slowly nodded her head as she kept her eyes locked with the creature's. Nico was pulled from her stare down with it when her mother grabbed her arm, frantically mumbling something under her breath. Nico bent down to try and hear her mother better. She listened carefully as her mother began to mumble again. Nico's eyes went wide when she finally was able to understand her mother, WW1. She asked, her voice shaking as she spoke. The creature smiled wickedly as it watched Nico slowly let go of her mother and back up a bit. Nico's body shook a bit. You're kidding, right? She asked her mother, hopping that it was a lie. Nico watched in horror as her mother shook her head. Fast a smile plastered on her face. The whole time, isn't it great, Nico? He can cure me, her mother said, happily looking at the creature before turning back to Nico to speak again. And all I have to do is release more things like him. Are you crazy? Nico yelled. Here, mother rolled her eyes at this, a small price to pay. Besides, it doesn't come back at me, she says proudly. Just then, it clicked in Nico's mind how she did it all. A sickening feeling formed in her stomach from the realization. Eriko's hands went over her mouth as her body began to shake. Horrible. Lie, you're better attaching these things to the people who come here, aren't you? She asked her mother in horror. Nico couldn't believe it as she watched her mother's smile grow bigger. She looked insane. Actually, Nico was started to believe she was. Yes, I have, but you see there was a small catch to it. All she tells Nico, she laughs. Nico glared at them both and... what is that? She hissed. Her mother glanced at the creature and let out a long sigh. Well, you see, I had 1 month to let out 14 of his followers. She tells Nico as she points at the creature. It was all Nico replied. Her mother walked up to her and grabbed her hands and ears, looking at her hopeful in the eyes. And today is the end of the month, and I only let out 13 of them, she tells her. Tessa raised an eyebrow at her. She didn't like where this was going at all. And if I don't let out all of them, he'll kill me. So be a good girl and let me attach the last one to you. She says, like, it was the most simply thing in the world, like attaching a balloon to a child's wrist. Nico shoved her mother away fast. The look of disbelief and betrayal on her face. Are you serious? She shouts as she heads towards the door fast. Once there, Nico turned halfway to glare at her mother and the creature, or should she say demon. You don't even care about the damage you've done. And to make it worse, you want to use me as a pawn, your own daughter, she yells back at them. Her mother reached her arm out at Nico, if I don't do this, kill me. She yells back. Nico grabbed the doorknob, yanking it open fast. She gave them both one more glance. You are already dying. You brought this on yourself, mother. I won't be a part of this. Nico says as she slams the door closed behind her. As Nico ran to her car, she heard her mother let out a blood-curdling scream. Nico closed her eyes tight as she fell to her knees. The tears fell down her face. She had no choice, she told herself repeatedly as she sat there crying. After sitting there for an hour, Nico stood up on shaky legs as she walked back into the house. She slowly opened the door and peered inside. There on the floor lied her mother's unmoving body. Nico let out a shaky breath as she grabbed the phone to call the police. to anyone else, it will look like the cancer finally won, but Nico knew the truth and she'd take that with her to the grave. She had to remember to call Frieza after it's all cleaned up. She might hate Nico, but she still had the right to know about their mother. After hanging up on the police, Nico began to look for her mother's book that held all the information on everyone she's seen. When Nico finally located it, she glared at it, her mother, and that demon might be gone. But now Nico has to clean it all up. She just hopes she's strong enough to do it on her own. Nico could hear the sirens as they approach. This is going to be a big pain. This would be a lot easier if you didn't lose your gift, Tresha. She says to herself as she goes to open the door for the police. Teresa sat straight up in her chair. She had so many emotions running through her. Shocked from what all she just heard. Angry at her mother for doing something so stupid. Betrayal at Nico for never telling her the truth of their mother's death. And hated at herself for all the things she did and said to Nico all those years ago. As Teresa was lost in thought, Nico and their mother started to argue again. You're seriously blaming me for this. Nico hissed at their mother. She rolls her eyes and lets out a small chuckle, and who else is to blame for my death? Nico let out a bitter laugh at their mother's question. Oh, I don't know. Nico shrugged before pointed a figure at her, maybe yourself. She snapped. Their mother glared at Nico again. Teresa would have done it. This brought Teresa out of her thoughts. She turned to their mother, fast mouth, hanging open in utter shock that she would ever say something like that. Teresa quickly looked at Nico to see her reaction. Nico, on the other hand, was silent before standing up and glaring at their mother, with more hated than Teresa had ever seen in her eyes. I've had enough of your stupid games and pity party. Nico shouts, moving from the table and headed to the bookshelf. Their mother's eyes flicked to the table, real quirk looking for something I wouldn't get your undead hopes up, they heard Nico say as she held her hand above her head, showing the glass purple stone hanging from her fingers. Teresa heard their mother let out a low growl before looking away from Nico. It was quiet for a bit as Nico searched the bookshelf for something. Teresa could hear Nico mumble no repeatedly as she looked for something. And silence was beginning to get to Teresa as Nico let out a victorious yes. And pulled a book from the very top shelf. She walked back to the table and slammed the book down in front of their mother and sliding it towards her now. You're going to fix whatever it was you did to Teresa. Teresa could hear the demand in Nico's voice as she spoke, and from the look their mother had, she heard it too. Nico sat back down in her chair waiting for their mother to do it. Their mother looked down at the book. She didn't even have to read the cover to know what it was. It is a book on sealing spells and potions. She knew what Nico wanted. A wicked smile formed on her face before she looked back at her two daughters. I don't think I will, she tells them smugly. Both daughters had a different expression. Teresa's eyes were wide-mouthed, slightly open from shock at their mother's behavior. Nico narrowed her eyes and clenched her jaw. Of course she would make this difficult. You can't undo it? Teresa asked hesitantly. She needed this, whatever broken, so she could help save Mimi. Their mother looked Teresa dead in the eyes, and the look she had made chills running up Teresa's spine. Oh no, I can undo it. I just don't want to, she tells them in a matter-of-fact tone. But why? Teresa asked. It's simple. She doesn't want to because she wants us to suffer. Nico tells her, isn't that right, mother? She asked as she clicks her tongue. Their mother thought about it for a moment before answering, well, not Teresa, but you. She tells Nico with a laugh, you don't know how many times I regret sealing your gift, she says, looking at Teresa. So why did you? Nico snapped. Their mother turned her attention back to Nico. She had no control, and after friend, I had no choice. And you don't know how much I wish it was you that I did it to, she hissed at Nico. Teresa brought her hands to her mouth, letting out a shocked gasp. She couldn't believe that she would say that. She turned to Nico to see if it upset her, but Nico looked unfazed by it. In fact, Nico just crossed her arms over her chest and sat back in her chair. So you finally admit it, huh? Was all she said. Their mother smiled a twisted smile at her. Why does it upset you? She asked, hoping to get a reaction from her. Nico let a snicker. No, not really. She tells her as she stretches her arms over her head. I've always known you favored Teresa more. Nico brings her arms back down and leans forward on the table, looking their mother in the eyes. But I will give you one last chance. Undo it. Nico tells her simply. Their mother gave Nico a challenging look. Never, she tells her smugly. Nico looks at her for a moment before pulling back slowly. Fine. I tried. That's all Nico said as she wrapped the glass stone necklace around her hand. Teresa and their mother watched. As she did so, Nico looked at Teresa before sparing a glance to their other. You brought this on yourself, she says as she slams her hand down hard on the table, breaking the stone in the process. The lights flicked and a strong gust of wind whipped through the house. Teresa covered her ears as a blood-curdling scream rang through the house and the lights went out completely out. Once the light came back on, Teresa looked around the room frantically, but all she seen was Nico and herself. Nico looked unfazed, but all that just happened as she stood up and headed to the front door. Well, that was a waste of time, was all she said as she grabbed the knob, opening the door. She turned back to Teresa, nudging her head towards the door. Come on, sis. Let's put an end to this, she says as she walks out the door, leaving Teresa there with her thoughts. Teresa balls up her fist as she follows Nico out the door. She was ready for this to end, and with Nico's help, she believes that they can save Mimi and get rid of Friend once and for all.